Today's story unfolds at a serene lakeside cabin. But beneath the calm waters lurks a storm of power, pride and confrontation. Isaiah Dunmore had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The city noise, the constant demands of work, and the endless notifications from his phone had left him drained. The lake cabin wasn't just another weekend rental. It was a place of family history and memory. His grandfather had built it decades ago with his own hands, laying the foundation stone by stone. And every summer Isaiah had spent there as a boy felt like an escape into another world. Now, as an adult, he cherished those same wooden walls and the gentle rocking of the water against the dock. The cabin stood at the far end of a small, private lake community, tucked between pines and birches, and it had always been a retreat for his family. When Isaiah arrived that Friday afternoon, the sky was pale blue with a thin breeze brushing the surface of the lake. He parked his truck near the gravel driveway and stepped out, breathing in the scent of wet earth and pine needles. The cabin's porch creaked familiarly under his boots, and he unlocked the door, feeling a small surge of peace as he crossed the threshold. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs of fishing trips, bonfires, and family gatherings that had happened long before any HOA had existed. The lake had been part of his childhood rhythm. Morning swims, evening campfires, the sound of loons echoing across the water at night. This wasn't just property, it was heritage. Isaiah carried that sense of ownership with pride. He had maintained the cabin himself, paying all the dues required, keeping the grounds neat and respecting every community rule written into his contract. He'd even rebuilt the dock last summer at his own expense to ensure it stayed safe for visitors and family alike. This weekend was supposed to be about unplugging, reading on the porch, and maybe casting a fishing line into the glassy water at dawn. There was a pot of chili already in the cooler, and a stack of books waiting on the cabin's old coffee table. For Isaiah, the cabin represented solitude and tradition in a world that seemed to grow louder and more complicated by the day. He looked out from the cabin window at the small path leading down to the lake. It was quiet, no jet skis, no crowds, just a few ducks gliding across the ripples. He felt grounded, at peace, and ready to reach. What Isaiah didn't yet know was that his quiet weekend would soon draw the entire community's attention. Constance Fairchild arrived, not long after Isaiah had settled in. The HOA president was known for her presence. People said she could fill a room, or in this case, a lakeside, with her voice alone. She drove a silver SUV that gleamed even under the dappled shade of the trees, and she parked it right at the edge of Isaiah's driveway as if she owned the space. Constance was a fixture in the neighborhood, a woman who had chaired the Homeowners Association for years, introducing stricter and stricter rules about everything from mailbox height to the color of shutters. To some, she represented order and tradition. To others, she was the face of overreach and intimidation. She stepped out, clipboard in hand, wearing a crisp navy blazer even though it was still early afternoon and warm. Her heels clicked against the gravel as she approached the porch. Without so much as a hello, she called out to Isaiah through the open screen door, her voice ringing with a practiced authority. She announced that there were approved guests of the community who needed access to his cabin for the weekend and that she expected him to hand over the keys immediately. Isaiah, still unpacking his bag in the living room, froze for a moment, unsure he had heard correctly. He came to the door and stepped onto the porch, the soft boards creaking beneath him. "Excuse me," he asked, his tone polite but firm. Constance repeated her demand, explaining that she had arranged for out-of-town visitors, friends of hers, though she referred to them as community guests, to stay in unused properties around the lake. In her view, Isaiah's cabin, sitting empty most of the year except for his visits, was fair game. He could see that she wasn't asking, she was expecting compliance. She pointed to her clipboard, rattling off an HOA bylaw number that sounded official but didn't seem familiar. Isaiah knew his rights and his responsibilities. He had the deed to the cabin, paid his taxes, and adhered to the association's regulations. Nowhere in the documents had he ever agreed to hand over his property to strangers at the whim of the HOA. Standing there on the porch, Isaiah felt a wave of disbelief. The cabin was not a community rental. It was his family's home. Constance, however, acted as if her title gave her unlimited control over anything within the neighborhood's boundary. She said things like, "It's for the good of the community and we all have to do our part," her tone mixing persuasion with command. From his vantage point, Isaiah could see two neighbors walking their dog at the end of the road, slowing down as they noticed Constance's. Their eyes flicked up to the porch, curious. The air felt charged, like a storm about to break. He realized this wasn't going to be a quick conversation. Isaiah took a breath, his mind flicking back to his grandfather's stories about standing up for what was right. He wasn't going to be bullied into surrendering his family's space. He told Constance, calmly but unmistakably, that she did not have permission to enter his property or to give his cabin to anyone. His words were measured, but they landed like stone. Constance's face tightened, and she drew herself up taller, gripping the clipboard as though it were a badge of office. She countered with a threat of fines, suggesting that refusal to comply might result in penalties or even legal action. Isaiah's heart beat a little faster, but he stayed steady. The idea that someone could walk onto his porch and demand the keys to his family's sanctuary was both insulting and surreal. He could feel the weight of the moment, the shift from an ordinary Friday afternoon to something far more serious, something that touched not just on property but on principle. The sun had dipped slightly lower over the lake, casting long shadows across the port. A loon cried out in the distance, the eerie sound echoing over the water, and for a second it felt as though the entire lake was listening. Neighbors' windows cracked open, a curtain moved, phones were being raised quietly to what had begun as a demand from a clipboard-wielding HOA president was turning into a public confrontation, one Isaiah hadn't invited but now had no choice but to face head-on. She claimed the cabin should be opened for approved HOA guests. Constance's voice, clipped and deliberate, carried across the porch and down the path toward the lake. It wasn't a suggestion but a pronouncement, the kind of statement meant to sound like law even if it wasn't. She gestured with her clipboard as if the pages in her hand gave her authority beyond question. Her words were dressed up in community spirit, but the tone underneath was unmistakable control. She spoke about approved guests, as though this was a normal arrangement, as though every owner along the lake should be ready to surrender their keys whenever the HOA requested. In her telling, the guests she had lined up were family friends of longtime members, visiting to enjoy the natural beauty of the lake community. She added phrases like "we're all neighbors, and this is how we maintain goodwill" to make it sound noble, as though Isaiah would be selfish to say no. From the porch, Isaiah listened carefully. He could see how Constance framed it. This wasn't a matter of his private property, she was saying, but of community obligation. She even dropped the names of other residents who had participated in similar arrangements, though Isaiah noticed she never gave specifics. To her, his family cabin, sitting quiet most of the year, was wasted space, a resource she could allocate to keep her circle of friends happy. She spoke with an ease that suggested she'd done this before and gotten her way. Isaiah glanced back into his living room at the photographs on the wall, his father teaching him to fish, his grandmother reading on the porch swing. This wasn't an empty rental or a guest house. It was part of his family's story. The way Constance talked about it, as if it were a spare clubhouse room, felt like an erasure of everything that mattered to him. He could feel the weight of her expectation pressing in, as though saying no would make him the villain in a story she'd already written. She continued to explain that the guests were due to arrive later that evening, and would need keys and access codes. She even asked him to provide the Wi-Fi password so they could enjoy their stay. Her tone suggested she had already promised them the place. She talked about their children, their need for a restful weekend, and how unfortunate it would be for the community if he refused. Each word was a thread trying to weave him into a decision he had never agreed to. The sun caught on the silver frames of her glasses, and for a moment her expression hardened. Isaiah realized she wasn't simply making a polite request. She was testing whether he would submit to her definition of community. Her insistence was not about helping guests, but about reaffirming her power as HOA president. Isaiah shifted his stance, one hand resting on the porch railing. He chose his words slowly, telling her again that the cabin was his family property and he had not authorized any visit. He said it without anger but without apology. A bird darted between the trees, and the faint sound of water lapping against the dock filled the silence after his words. Constance blinked, the lines at the corners of her mouth tightening. She was not used to being told no, and the neighbors who had begun to gather at the edge of the road seemed to sense it too. Isaiah calmly but firmly refused, citing his legal ownership. He could feel the heat of the moment rising, but his voice stayed steady. In his mind he rehearsed the facts. The deed with his name on it, the taxes he paid, the maintenance he did himself. He had every right to say no. He didn't raise his voice or try to match Constance's volume. Instead he spoke like someone who knew the ground beneath his feet was solid. He told her that the cabin was private property, that no HOA bylaw granted her authority to hand it over to anyone, and that he would not be unlocking it for guests he had never met. The calmness was deliberate. Isaiah had learned from his grandfather that staying steady in the face of provocation was its own kind of power. He held her gaze while he spoke, letting the words hang in the warm afternoon air. Around them the lake community seemed to pause. The couple walking their dog had stopped entirely now, pretending to adjust the leash while their eyes stayed fixed on the porch. A teenager across the water held up a phone, angling for a better shot. Constance shifted her clipboard to her other hand. Her expression flickered, first surprise, then irritation, then a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. She started citing bylaw numbers again, stringing them together like beads. But Isaiah interrupted gently, saying he had read the bylaws and nothing in them compelled him to surrender his property. His tone was polite, almost soft, but it landed like a gavel. He knew that standing firm was not just about this one incident. It was about drawing a line where none had been drawn before. The HOA had rules about noise, trash, lawn care rules he followed. But this was different. This was someone standing on his porch, demanding his keys as if his family cabin were a public park. He would not allow it. A breeze stirred the pine branches overhead, scattering needles across the porch steps. Isaiah felt a bead of sweat roll down his neck, but didn't move. He remembered the stories his grandfather told about times when saying no was necessary even if it made you unpopular. That memory steadied him now. Constance's voice rose slightly, tinged with disbelief. She said she had never been treated this way and that she was acting for the good of the community. Isaiah replied that he respected the community but that respect ran both ways. He said the cabin was not available, not now and not under these circumstances. He added that any further requests should be put in writing to his attorney. The words were careful, measured, each one a small wall building between his family's property and Constance's overreach. The sound of a screen door creaking open across the street broke the tension for a heartbeat. Another neighbor stepped onto their porch, arms folded, watching. It felt like a stage, the lake breeze carrying every word to an audience Isaiah hadn't asked for. Still, he stayed calm. He knew that anger would only feed the narrative Constance wanted to create. Instead, he relied on his certainty, his ownership, and his right to quiet enjoyment of his property. Constance's smile vanished entirely. She tightened her grip on the clipboard, the papers rustling under her finger. She said she would note his refusal and report it to the board, her tone a mixture of threat and disbelief. Isaiah didn't respond immediately. He let the silence sit between them, the sound of the lake filling it. Somewhere a boat engine started, then cut off again. The sky above the pines shifted to a deeper blue. In that moment, Isaiah realized the weekend he had planned, quiet mornings, reading on the porch, was slipping away. But he also felt a quiet strength, a conviction that holding his ground mattered more than any temporary peace. He had come to the lake to rest, but now he was standing for something larger than himself. Constance, meanwhile, stood at the foot of the porch, like a general whose command had been ignored, her SUV gleaming behind her, her posture rigid. She didn't back away, but she didn't step forward either. The air between them was charged, full of things unsaid. He thought of the old wooden beams under his feet, the smell of cedar inside the cabin, the echoes of family laughter. Those memories were part of why he refused now. They were reminders that this place was not a commodity or a favor to be traded, but a legacy to be protected. He stayed rooted in that knowledge as Constance spoke again, faster now, repeating the same arguments with new emphasis, trying to regain her foot. He answered each point with quiet certainty, citing ownership, citing his rights, and refusing to be drawn into anger. The neighbors watching shifted from curiosity to whispers. Some nodded subtly, others exchanged looks. Isaiah could feel the mood shifting around him even as Constance's voice pressed on. He was no longer just one man on a porch. He was a symbol, however briefly, of something that resonated with everyone watching. The line between community rules and private rights. The moment when an individual says no to intimidation. He held his ground, his hand still resting on the porch rail, the lake wind brushing his shirt, his eyes steady on the woman who believed her title could outweigh his ownership. Constance insists her authority supersedes his rights. Her words gained a sharper edge as she leaned slightly forward, narrowing the gap between the bottom of the porch steps and where Isaiah stood. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth, but her voice sliced through it, clipped and forceful. She began reciting phrases about community standards, the integrity of the association, and collective agreements, as though they were mantras that could bend reality. Her tone was a performance of control. Each syllable landed like a tap of a gavel. She wasn't just presenting a rule, she was trying to redefine the relationship between them. He, a mere property owner, and she, the president whose signature appeared at the bottom of every HOA newsletter. Constance's posture straightened even more, shoulders squared, chin tilted high. She reminded Isaiah that she had been elected by a majority of the homeowners and therefore represented the will of the community. She told him that his cabin, while privately owned, existed within a shared environment that gave the board broad discretionary powers. The words were delivered with the calm of someone used to winning disputes before they even began. Behind her, the polished hood of her SUV reflected the sunlight, making her look framed in a silver glow, a backdrop that seemed to amplify her performance. Isaiah watched her carefully, reading between the lines. She was taking the language of rules and stretching it into a weapon of control. He had seen this before, someone invoking the greater good to justify overstepping boundaries. Her insistence that she spoke for the community felt less like representation and more like ownership. She rolled out phrases about temporary easements and community welfare, terms that sounded official but in Isaiah's mind were flimsy pretexts. The small crowd nearby had grown slightly. A man with a baseball cap had stopped jogging and stood off to the side, one earbud dangling. A woman pushing a stroller slowed her pace, glancing from Constance to Isaiah. Their faces were neutral but alert, as though watching a tennis match. Isaiah could feel their attention, but he kept his focus on the woman in front of him. Constance's eyes flickered toward the onlookers, and then back to Isaiah. Her voice softened for a moment, cloaking itself in the language of neighborliness. She spoke about upholding tradition and mutual responsibility, as though she were appealing to a sense of duty rather than power. But underneath the soft words was a hard core. She believed her title gave her more claim to the cabin than the man who owned it. Isaiah could see the pattern. She used we and our when speaking about the cabin, as if his family property had already been absorbed into the collective. He noticed how she phrased her sentences: never your cabin, always the cabin on Lot 7, as though it were simply another community asset. Her eyes stayed locked on his, a steady challenge, while her fingers tapped against the clipboard rhythmically, an unspoken countdown to compliance. He could feel an old frustration rising but forced himself to breathe evenly. Constance's authority was a posture, but it was also a test. If he accepted her premise, even once, he would be setting a precedent. Her words were not just about this weekend, they were about establishing a norm in which his property was hers to allocate. Isaiah kept his voice level, his jaw unclenched, refusing to let her energy pull him into an argument that seeded the ground before it began. Above them, a hawk circled, its shadow crossing the water. The breeze carried the faint smell of charcoal from a distant grill. It felt surreal, this quiet, beautiful place, as the stage for a power struggle. Constance's voice, polished from years of meetings and speeches, echoed with an almost ceremonial gravity. She spoke of bylaws as if they were constitutional articles, and each time she said the board, it sounded like a court handing down a decision. Isaiah thought of the hours he had spent maintaining the cabin, patching the roof in cold rain, staining the deck until his hands ached, shoveling snow from the path in winter. None of that labor showed up in Constance's clipboard. None of it granted her the right to demand his key. She stood below him like an official delivering an edict. He stood above her on the porch like a sentinel protecting a threshold. Two opposing forces, each claiming legitimacy, separated by 3 wooden steps. The tense exchange draws nearby neighbors' attention. What began as a private standoff on a quiet afternoon was quickly becoming a small public theater. The sound of Constance's voice, sharp and commanding, carried easily across the still water and down the gravel road. One by one, doors cracked open, a curtain shifted. The lake community, usually content to mind its own business, now had a show to watch. A pair of teenagers paused at the edge of the dock across from Isaiah's cabin, their fishing rods dangling forgotten as they whispered to each other. A golden retriever barked once from a neighboring yard, then fell silent. The couple who had been walking their dog had stopped completely, standing just within earshot, their expressions unreadable. It wasn't just curiosity, there was a shared tension in the air, a recognition that this confrontation touched on something bigger than a single cabin. Isaiah noticed the eyes on him but didn't let it change his posture. He knew how quickly a narrative could form when a crowd was watching. One wrong tone, one sharp gesture, and he could be painted as aggressive rather than resolute. He kept his hands visible, resting lightly on the porch railing. His voice stayed calm, each word deliberate, even as Constance's tone sharpened like a knife. Constance, aware of the growing audience, adjusted her performance. She straightened her blazer, modulating her voice to carry a blend of righteous authority and wounded patience. She spoke louder, emphasizing community and responsibility, knowing her words would be heard by the gathering neighbors. She even turned slightly as she spoke, including the onlookers in her narrative, casting herself as the beleaguered president, trying to uphold order against an obstinate homeowner. The breeze carried her words farther than she might have intended. Phrases like non-compliance and undermining community trust floated across the water. Some neighbors exchanged glances. Others reached for their phones. A faint electronic chirp signaled that at least one person was recording. The atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to document. Isaiah felt the weight of every gaze. He understood instinctively that he wasn't just responding to Constance. He was also speaking to the community around them. His refusal was being witnessed, interpreted, perhaps judged. Still, he refused to shrink from. He reminded Constance again, this time in a slightly firmer tone, that the cabin was private property, and no bylaw could force him to hand over his keys. He used simple words, stripped of emotion, so there would be no misunderstanding. A soft murmur rose from the small group at the roadside. The man in the baseball cap scratched his chin, then nodded slightly. The woman with the stroller whispered something under her breath. The teenagers on the dock leaned closer, eyes wide. The scene had the feel of an unplanned meeting, a gathering without an agenda, yet charged with meaning. Constance sensed the shifting mood too. Her eyes darted from Isaiah to the neighbors and back again. She raised her chin higher, projecting confidence. She began to cite new bylaws, ones that sounded even more obscure, her voice climbing slightly as if to drown out the silent judgments around her. She invoked phrases like board-sanctioned access and temporary custodial rights, each one delivered with a lawyerly cadence. Isaiah didn't flinch. He let her words hang in the air before responding, each pause intentional. The quiet between them felt as heavy as the words themselves. The porch boards under his feet seemed to echo his heartbeat. He realized that Constance was not just trying to compel him, but to perform for the crowd, to make his refusal look unreasonable. If he remained steady, her performance would start to look like overreach rather than leadership. The lake breeze shifted again, carrying a faint scent of rain from the west. A cloud passed over the sun, casting both of them in softer light. Isaiah heard a phone camera click from somewhere behind Constance. Another neighbor coughed softly. The world felt both intimate and vast, every sound amplified. Constance continued, her words now a mix of frustration and righteousness. She accused Isaiah of breaking precedent, of failing to cooperate, of endangering the unity of the neighborhood. Each phrase was another attempt to define the story for the listeners around them. Isaiah answered only with facts, the deed, the payments, the absence of any clause granting her authority. His tone remained measured, his expression composed. The gathering had become undeniable now. People stood at windows, on porches, along the gravel road. The golden retriever barked again, and someone hissed it quiet. Even the teenagers on the dock had lowered their rods completely, their eyes fixed on the porch like theatergoers waiting for the next act. The confrontation, once private, was now a community event, its outcome uncertain, its meaning larger than either of the two figures at its center. Isaiah could feel the history of the place in his bones. His grandfather's hammer striking nails, his grandmother's humming as she swept the porch, his father's hand guiding the tiller on the old fishing boat. All of that heritage stood silently behind him as he faced Constance's He could feel the crowd weighing his every movement, the way a jury watches a witness. Constance's authority might fill a meeting room, but here on his porch, in the presence of neighbors, and the water in the pines, it had begun to look like something else entirely. Her voice rose once more, a crescendo of titles and bylaws, but Isaiah answered again with the same steady refusal, citing his legal ownership, his rights as a homeowner, his responsibility to protect his family's property. Each sentence was like a stone laid on a wall between her claim and his cabin. The neighbors watched in silence, the air around the lake charged, the water reflecting the standoff like a mirror. Some residents quietly support Isaiah, whispering about Constance's past over. The murmurs begin like ripples on the lake, faint but undeniable. A couple leaning against the hood of their car a few lots down exchange glances. The woman tilts her head and speaks under her breath. The man nods slowly. They remember the time Constance tried to impose a curfew on dock use, or when she sent warning letters about improper holiday decoration. A retired teacher walking his dog stops at the end of the gravel road, his eyes fixed on the scene, lips pressed tight as though weighing whether to say something aloud. Two women on a porch across the water watch with crossed arms, one whispering to the other about the newsletter Constance once sent shaming residents for not volunteering at an HOA event. The whispers are cautious, almost furtive. Constance has built an aura of inevitability around herself, and few have dared challenge it openly. Yet as they see Isaiah standing his ground, a kind of latent discontent rises to the surface. People remember fines they considered unfair, rules that seemed invented on a whim, and the feeling that Constance's leadership often drifted into personal control. One man thumbs through his phone, scrolling back to emails from the board that read more like ultimatums than updates. Another mutters that the HOA was supposed to be about maintenance and safety, not commandeering private property. Isaiah can sense the undercurrent even without hearing every word. The neighbor's eyes carry a flicker of recognition, the faintest nods of solidarity. He notices a man give him a subtle thumbs up, before turning away. A woman with a stroller speaks softly into her phone, glancing toward the porch as though reporting the scene to someone sympathetic. The quiet support is not loud enough to challenge Constance directly, but it is there, a background hum of agreement that cuts through her performance of authority. Constance, for her part, seems aware of the shift, but plows ahead. She squares her shoulders, speaking even louder, as though sheer volume can drown out memory. Her eyes sweep across the onlookers, catching a few in direct stare, an unspoken warning, but the crowd does not disperse. More people step out onto decks, leaning against railings. Watch. The air feels heavy with unspoken stories. A collective ledger of grievances now stirred by the confrontation at Isaiah's cabin. Others back Constance, believing she enforces community tradition. Not everyone watching is quietly sympathetic to Isaiah. A small cluster of longtime residents stand near the community bulletin board, arms folded, nodding subtly at Constance's words. They whisper to each other about how the lake used to be more orderly before new owners started treating it like a private playground. One man mutters that Constance keeps things civilized, and that if everyone just followed her lead, the neighborhood wouldn't slide downhill. An older couple near the mailbox exchange knowing looks, recalling how Constance organized the last lakeside cleanup and the annual picnic. To them, her authority feels earned, a bulwark against chaos. Their whispers carry a different tone: disappointment that Isaiah is making a scene, irritation at what they interpret as selfish. A woman in a sun hat says softly that the cabin sits empty too often and that it's only fair to let others enjoy it. Another adds that if Constance loses control, the whole place goes to pieces. This faction frames Isaiah not as a homeowner defending his rights, but as someone undermining the collective spirit that they believe has kept the community pristine. The divide is visible in body language. Those siding with Isaiah stand looser, arms uncrossed, expressions thoughtful. Those siding with Constance stand stiff, lips pursed, some nodding in rhythm with her sentences, as if at a sermon. The murmurs from both sides create a low, overlapping current, like two streams feeding into the same lake, but flowing in opposite directions. Isaiah senses the split without needing to look directly. He hears snippets of phrases: "She's right. Rules are rules. That's his property. She's gone too far," blending into an indistinct chorus. He keeps his eyes on Constance, but his peripheral vision registers the community arrayed, like a living map of tension. Sympathy here, loyalty there, a few undecided faces, hovering between. Constance capitalizes on her supporters. She turns slightly toward them as she speaks, using words like tradition, shared values, and protecting our investment. Her voice pitched to echo what they already believe. She gestures toward the lake, toward the manicured lawns, as living proof of her stewardship. Her supporters nod, murmuring agreement, and their subtle affirmations drift back to Isaiah like gusts of wind, carrying opposing scents. The scene has become more than a dispute over a cabin. It's a referendum on power and belonging. Each whispered comment, each folded arm or approving nod, adds to the invisible weight pressing on the porch. Isaiah stands at the center, feeling the heat of two sets of eyes: those who see him as a stand-in for their own frustrations, and those who see him as a threat to the order they cherish. Constance, flanked by unspoken loyalty, continues to wield her clipboard like a scepter, confident that enough of the crowd still sees her as the guardian of the lake, rather than its usurper. The lake reflects the gathering like a mirror: clusters of people, two currents of opinion, and in the middle a man and a woman locked in a contest of wills. Every rustle of pine needles seems to carry a whisper, every ripple of water a fragment of conversation. The confrontation has pulled the community out of their cabins and off their decks, revealing loyalties and grievances that usually stay hidden beneath polite small talk at HOA meetings and summer picnics. Isaiah breathes deeply, catching the scent of pine and lake water mixed with the faint aroma of barbecue from some distant yard. He can feel the line drawn through the crowd, one half rooting silently for him, the other convinced he's breaking the unwritten code of cooperation. The quiet becomes charged, the whispers weaving an invisible tapestry of support and opposition around the small patch of gravel where Constance stands and the 3 wooden steps where Isaiah holds his ground. Social media posts from witnesses start spreading the confrontation. A teenager across the lake tilts their phone, capturing short clips and uploading them instantly with captions about the HOA president and the man at the cabin. Another neighbor discreetly live streams from behind a screen door, comments popping up as people off-site react to the unfolding drama. Screens glow in the late afternoon light as photos, snippets of dialogue, and shaky videos ripple outward, traveling from private group chats to public feeds. Friends of residents begin messaging for details, fueling the sense that something bigger than a local dispute is happening. Constance threatens fines and HOA penalties on the spot. Her voice takes on a clipped, bureaucratic rhythm, listing amounts, deadlines, and citations as though reading from an invoice. She warns of escalating fees, legal letters, and suspension of privileges, her tone part official notice, part personal rebuke. She frames the penalties as inevitable consequences rather than threats, trying to recast her demand as routine enforcement. Neighbors shift uneasily as the numbers fall from her mouth. The transformation from neighbor to enforcer plain in her stance and in the metallic edge of her word. Isaiah documents everything on his phone for protection. The moment Constance began citing fines and bylaws, he slid his hand into his pocket. Feeling the cool rectangle of his phone, he drew it out slowly, deliberately, making sure his movements were calm and visible. The screen lit up, reflecting in his eyes as he unlocked it. With a few taps, the camera was rolling, the faint red dot blinking at the top of the screen like a tiny beacon. He held the device at chest height, angled slightly upward so both of them were in frame. The porch, the steps, and Constance standing at the bottom with her clipboard and commanding voice. He didn't narrate or provoke. He simply let the phone's microphone absorb everything. The crunch of gravel under Constance's shoes, the breeze through the pines, the sharp cadence of her words. The glow of the screen steadied him. In a situation that could so easily be twisted, documentation was his anchor. If she tried to escalate or misrepresent what was happening, he would have a clear record. The act of recording had an effect on Constance too. For a flicker of a second, her expression changed, her eyebrows lifting, her mouth tightening. She was used to controlling the narrative through newsletters, meetings, and whispered influence. But the phone was a neutral witness she couldn't command. Her voice dropped a shade, then rose again, as though she were recalibrating how she spoke, aware that each word could be replayed. Neighbors noticed the phone as well. A man leaning against his car nudged his companion and gestured toward it. The couple with the dog exchanged a glance of quiet approval. One teenager on the dock whispered, "He's filming her," to another, both of them angling their own phones to capture the confrontation from across the water. The scene had become a triangle of recording devices. Isaiah's deliberate, steady footage, Constance's performance at the steps, and the scattered amateur videos from onlookers like sparks flying off a single fire. Isaiah kept his phone steady, his thumb hovering near the screen to zoom if needed. He made sure to capture the clipboard, the SUV behind her, the subtle shift in her body language as she realized she was no longer performing only for a small audience, but for an invisible one beyond the tree. He didn't raise his voice or interrupt. He let the camera do its quiet work while he answered in measured tones. His heart beat faster, but the phone in his hand felt like a shield. The device held not just video but content. He had already saved PDFs of the HOA bylaws, copies of his deed and his tax receipts in a folder. If Constance tried to bluff with obscure terms, he could pull up the actual documents within seconds. The glow of the screen in his palm felt like a lifeline, proof that he wasn't powerless, that facts and evidence could stand against bluster. Each tap, each recorded second, was a small act of defense, a way of anchoring himself against her shifting claim. As the red recording dot blinked on, Isaiah noticed the wind pick up, carrying the scent of lake water and damp wood. Constance's voice cut through it like a blade, but now each word was captured, time-stamped, stored. He kept his face calm, his body language neutral, the phone held steady. He was not just a man at a cabin, he was a witness to his own experience, building a record in real time. Heated words escalate into shouting at the lakeside dock. What began as a sharp but controlled exchange started to fray at the edges. Constance's tone, once clipped and authoritative, grew louder, pushing against Isaiah's calm responses. Her sentences became longer, layered with accusations and implications about community standards, non-compliance and precedent. Her gestures grew wider, the clipboard snapping against her palm with each emphatic point. The volume rose enough that the quiet murmur of the lake seemed to recede. Birds startled from the branches overhead, fluttering out across the water. A child somewhere down the shore called for their parent, their voice lost under Constance's rising pitch. Even the golden retriever that had been barking occasionally fell silent, ears pricked as though sensing a storm. Isaiah held his phone a little higher, steadying it with both hands. He kept his tone even but firmer, repeating that the cabin was private property, and that he had not consented to any guests. Each time he spoke, Constance cut him off, her words overlapping his. The overlapping voices created a strange echo, bouncing off the water and the cabin wall. To the people watching, it looked less like a conversation and more like two worlds colliding, one grounded in ownership and boundaries, the other in authority and control. Neighbors shifted on their feet, some drawing closer to hear, others retreating to a safer distance. The teenagers on the dock had stopped whispering, and now simply stared, phones held high. Someone behind Constance muttered, "This is getting out of hand," but she pressed on, her voice straining against the wind. Isaiah's composure was being tested. He felt his pulse in his fingertips, the muscles in his jaw tightening, but he also knew that any sign of temper could be used against him. He took slow breaths, his eyes focused on a point just beyond Constance's shoulder, the line where the trees met the sky, using it as a horizon to steady himself. His answers came clipped now, like stones placed one after another. This is private property. There is no bylaw authorizing this. You are not permitted entry. Constance's cheeks flushed a deeper color. She accused him of disrespect, of undermining her work, of endangering the unity of the neighborhood. Her words piled up, each heavier than the last. The edge in her voice turned into a full shout, sharp enough to make some neighbors flinch. She pointed toward the cabin door, toward the dock, toward the lake itself, as though summoning the entire space into her argument. The sound of the confrontation carried far beyond the porch. Across the water, more curtains shifted. A man stepped out onto his balcony with binoculars, watching the scene unfold. The low thrum of a motorboat, starting somewhere down the lake, cut off abruptly, its driver choosing to idle rather than interrupt the spectacle. The quiet summer afternoon had turned into an amphitheater of tension, the dock and porch serving as its stage. Isaiah stayed rooted on the porch, the phone still recording, his voice steady even as hers rose. He began speaking fewer words, letting pauses stretch between them so her shouting echoed against silence. Each pause made her volume seem louder, less controlled, more like a display than an argument. Some in the crowd began to murmur again, their faces turning toward each other as though reassessing what they were seeing. The physical space between them became charged. 3 wooden steps separated Isaiah from Constance, but the energy felt like a gulf. The breeze off the lake tugged at his shirt, rattled the clipboard papers in her hand, and sent pine needles skittering across the gravel. He could smell the sharp tang of sunscreen mixed with the faint metallic scent of rain approaching. Each sensory detail etched the moment deeper into his memory. Even as Constance's voice rose, Isaiah's recording continued, capturing not just words but the cadence of the confrontation. The shuffle of feet, the rising crowd noise, the tension that seemed to vibrate in the air. He knew the footage would show not only her shouting but his restraint, the difference in tone between them. The blinking red dot at the corner of the screen felt like a heartbeat, steady and unyielding. Neighbors who had once looked bored now looked concerned. A woman in a blue tank top shook her head slowly. A man with crossed arms dropped them, exhaling audibly. The invisible lines of support and opposition from earlier were blurring under the weight of the scene's escalation. Constance's shouting no longer sounded like leadership to some. It sounded like desperation. Isaiah adjusted his grip on the phone again, his other hand still resting lightly on the porch rail. The wood beneath his fingers felt rough, but solid. He held onto that solidity as the moment swelled around him. The sound of the lake, the eyes of the neighbors, the rising voice of the HOA president echoing across water and wood. A neighbor calls local law enforcement to intervene. The decision happens quietly at first, a subtle action tucked among the onlookers. A man standing near the edge of the gravel road, his phone held low at his side, glances around as if gauging the crowd's mood. He unlocks the screen with his thumb and steps back a few paces, his voice low as he speaks into the receiver. Another neighbor, a woman with sunglasses perched on her head, catches his eye and raises her brows in silent question. He nods slightly, mouthing the word police without sound. Around them the tension has reached a pitch, where people are no longer simply spectators but participants in a story unfolding before them. The call travels from the lakeside to the dispatch center miles away. The operator's voice, calm and practiced, asks for details, while typing the information into a computer system. The neighbor describes the scene as best he can. A property dispute at the lake, an HOA president confronting a homeowner, voices raised. A crowd gathers. He doesn't dramatize it, but his tone conveys urgency. The operator assures him that a patrol car will be dispatched. Back at the cabin, no one hears the operator's keystrokes, or the click of a radio button, but the effect of the call is already in the air. Those who notice the man making it begin to whisper. The ripple of conversation traveling across the small assembly. A mother holding her child on her hip, mutters to another resident that this has gone too far. The couple with the dog shift their weight, one of them glancing down the road as if expecting sirens. The teenager who had been live streaming tilts their phone toward their own face, whispering to their viewers that the police are on their way. Isaiah senses something has changed. He sees glances flicking down the road, subtle movements of anticipation. He does not stop recording, but his thumb brushes the screen to ensure it is still captured. Constance, meanwhile, continues speaking in her clipped rhythm, but the edges of her voice betray a flicker of uncertainty, as though she too can feel the shift in the crowd's focus. She tries to regain control by reminding everyone that she is well within her rights, but some of her words fall into the murmuring instead of over it. The sun glints off the water, throwing bright shards of light against the underside of the porch roof. A breeze swirls through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of motor oil from a distant boat, and the heavier smell of earth warming in the afternoon. The normal sensory backdrop of the lake, birdsong, water lapping against rocks, is still present but muted by the collective anticipation of an arriving authority. Neighbors reposition themselves. Some step back to give space. Others edge closer to see everything that will happen. A man lifts his sunglasses and scans the road. Another adjusts his baseball cap and murmurs something into his own phone. The crowd has become a living barometer of expectation. Isaiah, still on the porch, straightens slightly, the phone steady in his hand. He remembers his grandfather's advice about staying composed when others act rashly. Each breath is measured, each movement deliberate. Constance notices the change too. Her eyes flick to the road for an instant, before snapping back to Isaiah. She raises her voice again, not in a shout but in a rallying tone, as if she can still direct the narrative, before another authority arrives. She lists the supposed bylaws once more, pacing her words like footsteps. But now the sound is overlaid with the murmured awareness of people waiting for the flash of a patrol car's lights. Deputies arrive and request both sides explain the situation. The first sign is the faint crunch of tires on gravel from beyond the trees. Heads turn down the road, as a white and blue patrol SUV appears, its lights not yet flashing but its presence unmistakable. The crowd shifts, making a narrow corridor along the edge of the lane. A second vehicle follows, slower, its windows rolled down to catch the sound. The deputies step out deliberately, not rushing, their movements practiced from countless calls where the real temperature of the scene isn't clear until they're inside it. One is tall and broad-shouldered, the other younger with a close-cropped haircut, and a notepad already in hand. Their uniforms are crisp against the muted greens and browns of the lakeside, the badges catching stray sunbeams. They close their car doors with solid thuds, glancing over the assembly before walking toward the porch. The murmuring dies to a hush. A neighbor pulls their child closer. Someone lowers their phone, suddenly aware of the seriousness of the moment. The deputies' boots crunch softly on the gravel as they approach, eyes moving from Isaiah on the porch, to Constance at the bottom of the steps, then to the semicircle of residents watching. The older deputy lifts a hand in a small calming gesture, and speaks with a steady neutral tone. "All right folks, let's take it easy. We're just here to understand what's going on." Constance straightens instantly, smoothing the front of her blazer. She begins speaking before they even reach her, her voice pitched to sound reasonable and put upon at once. She introduces herself by name and title, emphasizing her position as HOA President. She frames the situation as a misunderstanding, one she is trying to resolve for the good of the community. She gestures toward Isaiah and the cabin as she talks, her tone practiced, as though she's giving testimony at a hearing. Isaiah waits until she finishes before speaking. He lowers his phone slightly, but keeps it recording, the screen still glowing. When the older deputy turns to him, he states plainly that he is the property owner, that he has paid all dues, and that no clause in the HOA rules gives the president the right to access his cabin without permission. His voice is calm, his words clipped, each one chosen. The younger deputy flips open his notepad and begins writing as both sides speak. He notes names, times, key phrases, occasionally glancing up to gauge body language. The older deputy listens with arms folded loosely, nodding at intervals, occasionally asking for clarification. "Sir, you're saying you own the property outright?" "Ma'am, you're saying there's a bylaw granting access?" Each question is asked with an even tone, stripping away emotion to get at the facts. The neighbors watch as if witnessing a trial. Some tilt their heads toward each other, whispering their interpretations. The teenagers at the dock zoom their phones in for better footage. A dragonfly hovers in the sunlit space between Constance and Isaiah, its wings catching the light before darting away. The normal summer sounds of the lake return in faint bursts, the plunk of a frog, the lap of water against the dock, but the human soundscape is all held breath and murmur. Constance hands over her clipboard, flipping to a page she says contains the relevant bylaw. The younger deputy takes it, scanning the text with furrowed brows, then passes it to the older deputy. They exchange a brief look but say nothing yet. Isaiah, meanwhile, produces his phone again, pulling up the digital copy of the HOA agreement, ready to show them the section he believes proves his point. The glow of the screens, one phone, one clipboard page, stands out against the rustic wood of the porch, and the bright green of the tree. The older deputy asks both of them to step slightly apart, so they can speak individually. Constance complies immediately, moving a few feet down the gravel path, but her voice carries as she explains her side again. Isaiah remains on the porch, holding his phone steady, answering each question as it's asked. The deputy's tone stays neutral, but the simple act of their presence reshapes the scene. The shouting has stopped, the crowd has gone still, neighbors sense that a decision point is near. Some fold their arms tighter, others look relieved. The couple with the dog exchange a small nod. The teenager on the dock whispers into their phone,
Cops are here. They're talking to both of them. The entire lakeside seems to exhale, waiting for the deputies to decide what comes next. The sun has shifted lower, casting long shadows from the pines across the gravel and onto the cabin steps. The smell of the lake intensifies as the breeze dies down, carrying a faint metallic hint from the patrol as everything feels slowed, suspended, as the deputies gather facts, their pens scratching softly against paper, their eyes moving from one face to another, from the cabin to the clipboard to the silent semicircle of neighbors. Constance's gestures become smaller, more contained, as she senses the deputies' careful attention. Isaiah's breathing stays even, his posture still. Around them the murmuring is replaced by the steady hum of insects, the occasional creak of a dockboard, the soft flutter of leaves. The community that had been split into whispers of support and opposition now stands together in a quiet half-circle, their differences muted by the arrival of uniformed authority and the promise of some kind of clarity.
Isaiah presents proof of ownership and shows he's within his rights. When the older deputy turns back toward the porch and asks if he can verify what he's saying, Isaiah scrolls with steady fingers to the folder he had prepared days before. His phone glows pale blue against the fading light as he opens a PDF of the deed. He holds it up so both deputies can see the header, the parcel number, his name printed in black. The screen trembles only slightly in his hand, but his voice remains even. He explains that the cabin has been in his family for years, purchased long before the current HOA board existed, that dues have been paid every season, and that no agreement grants open access to his property. The younger deputy leans closer, eyes scanning the document, then nods to the older one. Isaiah taps to another file. The HOA bylaw is saved as a searchable PDF. He has already highlighted the sections about common areas and member obligation. He tilts the screen again, showing them that nowhere does it mention private dwellings being opened for use by the board or its guests. He doesn't rush his words but lets them land one at a time, each supported by a line on the glowing page. Around them the crowd shifts to get a better view. Some neighbors crane their necks, whispering that they didn't know Isaiah had that kind of preparation. Others exchange glances, as if reconsidering what they've believed about Constance's authority. The couple with the dog nods almost imperceptibly at each other. Even the teenagers on the dock pause their streaming to zoom in on the screen he's holding up. Isaiah flips to his tax receipts next, showing payments made to the county, evidence of clear type. He mentions the date of his last dues payment, the letter he received confirming it, the lack of any notice about guest privileges. Each item is time-stamped, labeled, and neatly arranged in his phone. The deputies take their time reading, their posture relaxed but attentive, pens still scratching notes. The older one asks a few clarifying questions: parcel boundaries, mailing address, whether any easements exist, and Isaiah answers calmly, the information already on his lip. Constance stands a few feet away, arms crossed now, clipboard tucked under one elbow. Her mouth tightens as Isaiah swipes to yet another document. She shifts her weight from one foot to the other, looking toward the crowd as though seeking support, but the murmurs that reach her sound different now, less certain, more curious. She glances back at the deputies, waiting for a chance to interject, but they are focused on the glowing phone and the man holding it with such deliberate steadiness. The scene feels almost ceremonial, the rustic porch transformed into a makeshift courtroom where evidence is presented under the open sky. The smell of pine needles and lake water mixes with the faint tang of the patrol SUV parked nearby. Insects buzz at the edges of the crowd, but no one moves to swat them away. All eyes are on the phone, the deputies and the man asserting his right to stand on his own porch without yielding. Constance's claims start to crumble under question. When the older deputy finally hands the clipboard back to her, and asks her to point to the clause she's relying on, she flips through the pages more quickly than before. The plastic sleeves crinkle under her finger. She stops at a section about shared amenities, and traces a line with her pen, explaining that the cabin's location on the lake makes it a community resource. Her voice carries the same official tone she used at board meetings, but there's a faint tremor beneath it. The younger deputy leans in, reading the line she's indicating. His brow furrows. He asks a simple question: does this section mention private homes? Constance hesitates, then admits that it refers to docks and boat launches maintained by dues, not to individually owned houses. She pivots to another page, pointing to a paragraph about emergency access, but the older deputy asks calmly whether there is an emergency now. She opens her mouth, then closes it again, the answer clear. Each question from the deputies chips away at the edifice of her authority. She explains that past presidents have arranged informal use of certain properties for visiting guests, But when asked if there are signed agreements or written policies, she concedes there are none. She mentions tradition and understood norms, but the deputies repeat that they can only act on what's written, not what's assumed. The crowd begins to murmur again, the sound like wind through tall grass. A neighbor whispers to another, "I knew she didn't have that power." Someone else nods slowly, arms uncrossing. The teenagers on the dock whisper excitedly into their phones, their comments scrolling faster as viewers pick sides. The collective shift is visible in the way people stand, shoulders turning subtly toward Isaiah rather than Constance. Constance's gestures grow tighter, more defensive. She tucks a strand of hair behind her ear, flips another page, but each time she tries to pivot, the deputies return to the basic facts: deed ownership, bylaws, consent. The steady rhythm of their questioning acts like a tide eroding the sandcastle of her claims. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, softens at the edges, losing some of its practiced authority. Isaiah remains on the porch, still recording but now silent, letting the deputy's questions speak for him. The glow of his phone screen casts a faint light on his fingers as he steadies it. He doesn't smile or gloat. His face is composed, eyes focused. The rough wood under his palm feels solid, grounding him as the tide turns. The deputies exchange another look, then one of them notes aloud that they see no violation of law on Isaiah's part. They ask Constance if she has any further documentation. She hesitates, shuffles the papers, then says she will have to consult the board. The older deputy nods once, his expression neutral, then jots something in his notebook. The younger deputy closes his notepad with a soft snap. Around them the air feels different, as though a storm has passed without rain. The breeze off the lake lifts Constance's papers, rattling them lightly. The crowd shifts again, a soft rustle of movement, as people reposition themselves, no longer leaning forward but settling back. The lake water laps gently against the dock, the sound filling the silence where Constance's certainty had been. Neighbors exchange glances, some with raised eyebrows, some with small smiles of relief. A man near the edge of the road lowers his phone, ending his record. The couple with the dog loosen their grip on the leash, the retriever wagging its tail again. Even the teenagers' live stream commentary softens, their voices quieter as they narrate the reversal playing out before them. Constance stands still, clipboard pressed to her chest now, eyes on the deputies, her lips part as if to say more, then pressed together again. The authority she had projected all afternoon hangs like mist, thinning under the weight of simple questions and clear evidence. Isaiah's phone screen goes dark as he lets it drop to his side, still running but no longer needing to be displayed. The porch, the steps, the lake and the crowd hold the quiet echo of a shift. One person's confidence giving way to another's steady preparation. The balance of power tilting under the open sky. The crowd of neighbors grows, murmuring as the truth unfolds. More people drift from their porches and docks, drawn by the low voices and the presence of the deputies. Small knots of conversation form at the edge of the gravel road, some residents whispering their surprise at what they're hearing, others recounting earlier encounters with the HOA president. Phones stay raised, capturing the shifting scene as support for Isaiah quietly solidifies. Deputies warn Constance about trespassing and misuse of authority. Their tone remains calm but unmistakably firm as they explain the limits of her role, pointing out that private property cannot be commandeered under tradition or informal arrangement. Constance's shoulders stiffen at the words, her clipboard clutched tightly while the murmurs of the crowd swell behind her. Isaiah stays composed, refusing to be intimidated. He stands on the porch with his phone still recording, posture steady, eyes fixed on the deputies rather than Constance. His voice stays low and measured as he answers questions and repeats his rights, each word reinforced by the documents already shown. The calmness in his tone begins to feel like another kind of strength to the onlookers, a quiet counterweight to the tension that had filled the afternoon. Conversations ripple across group chats, neighborhood meetings and social media posts, as residents reassess long-held assumptions about rules, ownership and leadership. Some call for policy changes, while others question whether the board's reach has grown beyond what members intend.